Twine became an important part of agriculture in the mid-19th century. As a tying material, it was first used in hay presses, binders, and then, somewhat later, in balers. Since the 1960s, twines made of natural fibers have been replaced by synthetic ones. The impact of twine on the harvesting of grain and hay can be called phenomenal, without exaggeration. In the early 19th century, as part of the Industrial Revolution, wheat factories were established in the United States. At the same time, agricultural equipment manufacturers were working to invent and mass-produce machinery capable not only of quickly and efficiently plowing and sowing, but also of speeding up grain harvesting. The most important of these inventions is considered to be the mechanical reaper, which Cyrus McCormick successfully demonstrated in 1831 in a wheat field near Steele's Tavern, Virginia. The word "successfully" is emphasized here, as similar machines by other inventors, albeit less successful, were already in existence at the time. American invention in this line, so far as there is any record, began with the patent issued to Richard French and T.J. Hawkins of New Jersey, May 17, 1803. Unfortunately, no reliable description of this machine appears to have survived. Before the mechanical reaper, farmers had to harvest grain with an age-old scythe, improved only with the addition of the cradle that helped scoop the gavels of cut stalks into piles. The stalks would then hand-tied into sheaves and stacked to dry, after which it would be threshed to separate the grain from the chaff. McCormick's reaper was a horse-drawn machine with a moving cutter bar that cut the stalks with knives and a reel that laid them onto a platform, from where a worker, walking behind the reaper, hand-raked them by hand upon the stubble. At the first demonstration of McCormick's machine, one man harvested 6 acres of grain in less than half a day, a job that formerly took 6 workers to accomplish. Today, this device may seem simple to us, but McCormick spent nearly a decade perfecting its production, making a number of modifications. Over time, the reapers were further improved, including a seat for the rake operator directly on the platform, followed by automatic rakes and dumpers. However, all these reapers dumped portions of the cut stalks upon the stubble, where they were manually tied with straw bands into sheaves. In these film stills, Mr. Henry Ford demonstrates how this was done. Binding sheaves by hand was a tedious and arduous task, requiring the worker to constantly bend over each bunch of cut stalks to tie them into sheaves. In 1858, 2 young farmers, the Marsh brothers from DeKalb, Illinois, patented a reaper with an added riding platform for the tying worker. Now, instead of walking behind the reaper, the binder rode on it and tied the sheaves directly on the platform. It's worth noting that, whether the brothers knew it or not, the idea of tying grain in this manner was not new. The first reapers to carry human binders in their receiving boxes were machines built by Augustus Adams and George Gidford of Elgin, Illinois, tested one in 1850 and the other in 1851. The Marsh harvester became the prototype for all machines which since have carried binders, whether men or automatic machinery substituted in place of men, to bind grain before delivery to the ground. No other harvesting machine before it had lived to establish a general trade. Since the advent of the Marsh harvester, the term harvester has been applied almost exclusively to the particular kind of machines which carry binders, whether men to bind by hand or automatic binders. The Marsh manual tying harvester increased the speed of grain harvesting. It quickly gained popularity and in terms of cost-effectiveness was a successful competitor to any type of tying machine, regardless of the binding material used. Farmers quickly adopted mechanical reapers, which provided a huge advantage in grain farmers. But in the 1850s and 1860s, they still required a large amount of expensive manual labor. Thus, implement manufacturers and inventors understood the need for a machine that could reap and bind the cut grain stalks into sheaves. The first evidence of these attempts is a patent issued to John Heath of Warren, Ohio, in 1850. However, his combination reaper and twine binder had too complex binding mechanism to be practical in the field. Although several machines were built, the project did not get much past the experimental stage. Over the next decade and a half, numerous patents were issued for self-binding machines using metal wire, twine, or straw bands, but they were still very complex, and none can be considered successful. Numerous unsuccessful attempts to attach binders to reapers drew the attention of inventors to another method of gathering and binding the grain, resulting in the peculiar machine called the gleaner, which was a binder attached to a raking device for gathering gavels deposited on the ground from a reaper. The patent for the first such machine was granted to M.T. Ridout on November 14, 1871. Perhaps the most successful and popular model of the first practical binders was the development of Charles Withington, who built a self-binding reaper in 1872 based on a Marsh harvester and an improved binding device patented in 1865 by S.D. Locke of Janesville. The invention was eventually sold to the McCormick Company and became part of their wire binding machine design. Quite a few wire binding machines were sold, but most farmers abandoned them because the wire caused significant problems when livestock ingested wire that accidentally remained in the straw after threshing. This often resulted in cattle mortality. Wire fragments from the sheaves also often disabled the mechanisms of threshing machines and mills, and sometimes caused fires or explosions. Thus, it was necessary to revisit the idea of a binder that could use a more flexible, digestible, and degradable product, a product like straw, cord, or twine that could tie bundles tightly. Straw binders seemed preferable to farmers. Straw was a vastly less expensive alternative to wire, cord, or twine, and was digestible and degradable. Several such machines were patented and built, but they were bulky, complex in design, impractical for farms, and inefficient. Meanwhile, others were working to create a mechanical for twine. John Appleby made the most successful one, leading Cyrus McCormick to proclaim him one of the greatest names in the history of American invention. In the spring of 1844, John Francis Appleby, aged 4, was brought to Wisconsin, where he grew up on his parents' farm in Walworth County, receiving his education in the local school during the rare periods when he wasn't needed for work at home or on neighboring farms. Even as a child, John showed a talent for inventing various mechanical gadgets. He built a simulacrum of a bicycle to ride to school, and later attempted to build a perpetual motion machine. In the summer of 1856, while working on his stepfather's farm in Iowa County as a binder behind a reaping machine, the 16-year-old conceived the idea of creating a machine for this task. He certainly wasn't the first to come up with this idea, but many obstacles prevented other inventors from pursuing the project, primarily the lack of understanding of how a mechanical arm could tie a knot in a rope. The invention of a rope knotter was a colossal task compared to other challenges in farm machinery. In 1858, in a small workshop in Hart Prairie, the young Appleby constructed a prototype knotter, likely the world's first capable of tying a knot in rope. As the story goes, he was inspired to invent the rope knotter by seeing a girl playing with a Boston Terrier puppy and a jump rope. Apparently, when the girl accidentally dropped the rope on the dog's head, the knotter shook himself and retreated, inadvertently leaving the rope knotted on the ground. Appleby's first knotter worked on a similar knotting principle. Lack of funds prevented Appleby from further developing his knotter, and with the outbreak of the Civil War, he volunteered to serve in the 23rd Wisconsin Infantry. While Appleby served in the Army, significant advances were made in machine knot tying technology. In February 1864, Jacob Behel of Rockford, Illinois, obtained a patent for one of the most important inventions ever made on binders: knotting bill and turning cord holder. The bill seized the portions of the cord which were to form the knot, and looping the same, moved back past the knife, which severed the cord at the proper point, leaving the end of the cord from the reel firmly held by the turning cord wheel. To make the operation of the cord knotter clear, a series of pictures is reproduced here, showing the same knot being tied by hand in the same manner as by the binder. The knotting bill, later known as a knotting hook, became the basis for the vast majority of binders and balers produced worldwide. Meanwhile, having returned from his service, Appleby settled in Mezomany, Wisconsin, where he continued to work with knotters. In 1867, he demonstrated his first complete machine, but the demonstration was unsuccessful and earned him a reputation as an eccentric. In 1872, Appleby contacted Parker and Stone of Beloit, Wisconsin, and built a wire binding machine at their plant. It was successful, but failed due to farmers' prejudice against wire as a binding material. The widespread rejection of wire binders by farmers prompted Appleby and his partners to begin developing a twine binder. Appleby's new machine combined his own previous work with ideas from other inventors, including the knotting hook. The Appleby's knotting device, mounted on a Marsh harvester, was successfully tested in a rye field in Beloit in 1875. Several more Appleby machines were built after this, and major harvester manufacturers observed them in action in various locations. In the winter of 1878, William Deering, recognizing the potential of the new machine, purchased the rights to it to replace the wire binder he had previously used. This was the first large-scale production of the Appleby knotter, marking the beginning of its widespread adoption on harvesters. McCormick, Champion, and Osborne acquired the rights and began manufacturing this type of machine. Soon, all others were eclipsed by its superiority. Wire binder manufacturers were quickly driven out of the market, and harvesting machines incorporating the basic elements of the Appleby knotter were tying 9/10 of all grain grown worldwide. Charles Marsh, one of the inventors of the Marsh harvester, who by then had left his career in agricultural machinery to edit farm implement news, said of the Appleby, "No name is so well known among persons interested in harvesting machines as that of John F. Appleby, and no machine ever swept over the world with such overwhelming rapidity, once it got started, as the twine binder designated the Appleby." This success was not due to the newness of the devices applied, nor to the surpassing character of Mr. Appleby's genius, although he has been a persistent and clear-headed inventor. But it would seem that the ingenuity of a number of inventors, running in the same direction, had become masked or damned before certain common obstructions, beyond which they could not flow, and it was reserved for him to combine in his binder built upon the Marsh harvester the most practical of these principles, directing the best efforts into one channel, and by devices of his own to remove the obstructions, thus opening the way for the flood that followed. Another challenge that binder manufacturers had to overcome was finding a type of cord or twine that would best suit the mechanical knotter and meet farmers' standards for tight tying. For binder purposes, the twine must be of a specific type, should have 16 turns to the foot, and a length of 3 feet, would have a breaking strength of not less than 70 pounds. The twine must be carefully made, free from swells or knots, or it will not run smoothly through the knotting device of the binder. The lack of suitable and affordable binding twine sometimes became an insurmountable problem for binder inventors and manufacturers. Talcott, Emerson and Company of Rockford, Missouri, yielding to the objections against wire, replaced their wire twister with a twine knotter, which was successfully launched in 1860. The following winter, Mr. Emerson went to every twine factory in the United States and to agents of foreign manufacturers of twine to find or to get made what should be sufficiently cheap and also strong enough for practical use as material for binding. Nothing then could be produced, on account of war prices and crude machinery that would answer the purpose. Still determined to succeed, Talcott Emerson and Company imported machinery and began manufacturing twine, but their factory burned up soon after and they discontinued further efforts. The more successful McCormick Company, known after 1902 as International Harvester, John Deere, Massey, Case, Minnesota, and other farm tool makers subsequently sold tens of thousands of binders. Such high production levels required vast quantities of binder twine, and factories were opened across the United States and Canada to meet the demand. But at the dawn of binders, there were only 3 cordage mills in America, and they didn't produce the required single-strand twine, requiring new lines of equipment to establish production. William Deering launched the production of binder twine in the United States, contracted with cordage manufacturer Edwin Fitler of Philadelphia. Fitler was initially reluctant to add the necessary machinery for twine making until he learned that Deering intended to place an initial order for more than 10 carloads of twine. Years later, Fitler was fond of telling how he made a $1 million deal with William Deering in 2 minutes. To create a strong yet flexible twine, Fitler used Manila hemp, also known as abaca fiber, made from fibers stripped from the bark of a variety of banana tree native to the Philippines. It derives its name from the port of Manila, from where it was largely exported. The plant grows readily from seed and also from shoots or suckers, and often grows to the height of 20 or 25 feet, having a tuft of leaves only at the top. When it was properly mature, it was cut at the root, and, after being stripped of its leaves, the fibers were extracted. Before improved machines were available, the strips were beaten on smooth wooden blocks with clubs or mallets until the pulp or body was broken up, when it was scraped with knives. The fiber length varied from 5 to 15 feet. After drying and cleaning, it was tied in hanks and placed into 270-pound bales, covered with grass matting, tightly bound with rattans, and shipped to cord mills in the United States, England, and France. The voyage took about 4 months. Manila hemp had the longest and strongest fiber known. Some types of twine were made from raw materials imported from India, Haiti, and Tanganyika, now Tanzania, but twine made from the fibers of the henequen plant, Agave phoracroides, and sisal, Agave sisalana, both native to Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, proved to be durable and much less expensive. Both plants are members of the agave family, and the fiber from them is collectively known in the textile industry as the sisal, named after the port of Sisal, from which it was initially exported. Yucatan is situated on a semi-arid limestone karst that makes the land untillable. One Yucatecan once told a reporter, "I have always thought when God made Yucatan his original purpose was to use it for hell. He neglected to give it any water or any soil." Yucatan's depleted soil, however, proved ideal for growing agave. Moreover, this fiber plant has only been successfully grown for industrial purposes in this state. Many other states in Mexico and other South American countries, such as Nicaragua, have attempted to cultivate it, but have given up. Henequen and sisal survive and thrive in the unique geography of the Yucatan by storing water in their fleshy leaves. The plant is best propagated by cuttings. They require little care, but are quite slow growing, requiring about 8 years for cuttings to develop into plants, after which, if moderado care be exercised, they will last for many years. The leaves are cut from the ground up, from time to time, as they mature and lengthen with a special tool, a cross between a sickle and a carving knife, and called by the natives corba. The leaves produce fine fibers, 3 to 6 feet long. The fiber pulp is extracted from the leaves using a decorticator. The fiber is then stretched on wire in the open sun to dry, then packaged, usually in 400-pound bales, and transported to the port for shipment to rope manufacturers. An acre of henequen yields 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of fiber. Each pound of dry fiber can produce up to 500 feet of twine. Maya Indians and later Spaniards and Mexicans had long used the henequen fibers to make mats, hammocks, and rope. Since Yucatan was relatively close to the United States, sisal became the fibers of choice for rope and twine production by American cord mills. Having solved many problems in grain harvesting, this binding material remained a staple in farmers' fields for many decades. After demand for the fiber increased thanks to the use of binding materials in North America, hundreds of thousands of previously uncultivated acres in Yucatan were converted into henequen plantations. Eventually, the area covered 524,000 acres, nearly half the state. This thorny plant became the center of economic life in Yucatan. In 1873, Yucatan exported 31,000 bales of henequen. In 1904, 606,000 bales, and in 1915, just under 1.2 million bales were shipped. Sisal exports brought wealth to Yucatan, at least for landowners, investors, merchants, bankers, and fiber traders. Traditionally one of Mexico's poorest states, it became one of the wealthiest. The capital of Yucatan, Mérida, became the first city in Mexico to be fully lit by electricity and is arguably the most modern urban center in the country. 4,000 miles of railway lines were laid throughout the state, connecting sisal plantations with processing facilities, as well as settlements with one another. Manila hemp makes a much better twine, being stronger, smoother, and more durable. However, the raw material is more expensive, and its twine sells for more than sisal. On the other hand, sisal twine breaks much oftener while running through the binder than the Manila. At every break, the farmer must stop his machine and spend 10 or 20 minutes to fix up. McCormick's company was one of the first to experiment with sisal fiber from Yucatan, but it gave unsatisfactory results at first. The knot strained, and the twine did not pass smoothly. However, over time, manufacturers discovered that the optimal blend of Philippine abaca and Yucatecan henequen made very strong, rot-resistant, and insect-proof binder twine. Always the most expensive at more than 10 cents per pound was pure Manila twine, made from Philippine abaca. Various Manila sisal mixtures, referred to as Superior Manila, Manila, and Standard Manila, were cheaper. The least expensive and most popular types were the standard and white sisal binder twines that were made of Yucatan fibers. Other companies, including Plymouth Cordage of Massachusetts, Peoria Cordage of Illinois, and others, began importing Yucatan twine in the 1880s. 90% of all twine used in or exported from the United States was made from sisal, and 90% of it was grown in the Yucatan. Around the turn of the century, McCormick established connections with Henry Peabody and Company of Boston, which bought and traded fiber internationally. He struck deals with them that gave him, after 1902, International Harvest, a monopoly on fiber imports and twine production. By 1904, they were importing nearly half of the Yucatan sisal supply, producing twice as much twine as other companies combined, and forming a trust with other companies, controlling twine prices. From 1902 to 1915, International Harvester controlled 90% of the Yucatan fiber trade, reaching a record 99.8% by 1910. Here's how historian Casson described the workings of a cord mill in the days. Employee welfare was a big concern at IH's Deering Twine Mill, where a large number of women worked, who made $1 a day, 10 cents an hour at 10-hour shifts. Women workers were outfitted in special caps, aprons, and shoes and given pie and coffee breaks in the factory's cafeteria. At the twine works, a bedlam of noise and fuzz, the pure fiber was put through 8 different machines to comb and straighten it. Then, using giant spinners with bobbins, machines further reduced it to approximately 75 strands twisted 14.5 times per foot before being balled and packaged. Depending on the exact brand or fiber mixture, the balls averaged 500 to 650 feet of twine per pound and generally weighed 8 pounds each. Finally, 6 to a bale, the balls were packaged and tied with 14 feet of lightweight rope for easily handling. This rope was a bonus. Farmers could always find use for the extra rope. International Harvester launched itself into the cordage business by building 4 huge twine mills in Chicago, New Orleans, St. Paul, and Hamilton, Ontario, and by acquiring the immense Deering Twine Works, also in Chicago, for a total of 4,248 spindles and hundreds of spinners in each factory. Its main Chicago twine mill was a huge structure standing 5 stories high and occupying nearly 500,000 square feet of floor space, with a capacity to produce 30,000 tons of binder twine a year. International Harvester's largest competitor was the Plymouth Cordage Company of Massachusetts, which had been manufacturing cordage products since 1837. Not everyone was favorable to McCormick's Sisal Trust. Wary of monopolistic trends in the industry, state and provincial policymakers on the Great Plains and the Midwest decided to compete by using prison inmate labor to produce twine for less money. Minnesota officials pioneered this idea at their prison in the 1880s, followed by Kansas and North Dakota in 1899, South Dakota in 1909, and Wisconsin in 1916. The Canadian government opened a twine factory at its federal prison in Kingston, Ontario, in 1894. These penitentiaries offered twine that was typically at least 1 cent per pound cheaper than rope company brands. Competing twine and rope companies, in turn, filed antitrust lawsuits, and the U.S. government launched an investigation into IH's activities under the Sherman Antitrust Act. But neither competitors nor government sanctions could break IH's monopoly on Yucatan henequen, but the Mexican Revolution. 1915 marked the beginning of many changes in Mexico, including the restoration of Yucatan henequen control. The anti-foreign monopoly ideals of the Mexican Revolution were being applied in Yucatan to break the stronghold the International Harvester Company enjoyed on importing fiber. The new Yucatan government dissolved the trust, but that same year formed its own trust with 5 major United States banks and raised the price of sisal significantly. This was in 1915, when the Great Plains had a bumper wheat crop, the best in 80 years. Farmers' dependence on binder twine became so great that supply disruptions seriously disrupted the industry, especially grain producers. By 1900, demand for twine was so enormous that more than half of all fiber imported into the United States was used to make binder twine. Over the next 3 decades, Americans consumed approximately 200,000 tons of binder twine annually, and Canadians consumed another 35,000 tons. Between 1919 and 1921, a controversy erupted in South Dakota, shaking its major industry, agriculture, and involved a diverse array of residents, from farmers to farm supply dealers to state officials. Fueled by internal conflict, sabotage by inmates producing sisal twine at the state's twine factory, housed in the South Dakota Penitentiary in Sioux Falls, wreaked havoc on fields across the state and reverberated in the halls of the Capitol. A large shipment of twine was found to be damaged by cuts. The factory had previously been quite successful, reporting a net profit of $50,424.40 in 1919. Affected consumers were compensated, and all damaged twine was rewound and sold for 2.5 cents per pound, less than the price of new twine. Periodic cricket and grasshopper infestations from the 1910s to the 1930s were as devastating to the twine as they were to the grain itself. Commercial manufacturers supplied oil and poison-treated twines to reduce cricket damage. But this didn't help much. The insects ate the twine after the oils dried out. In 1935, in South Dakota, crickets had cut the twine so badly that farmers' considerable losses in twine and grain waste were incurred. 18 farmers asked the state for adjustment for damage, 5,900 pounds of twine. In the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, the port of Progreso, from which all of the fiber was exported, was blockaded in February 1915. The blockade tied up 250,000 bales of sisal. News of the blockade came in a year in which conditions indicated that a bumper crop for North American grain was in store. This caused deep concern among farmers, agricultural traders, and rope companies. At the time, 200 million pounds of twine were used in the United States each year to bind grain, flax, and corn, and 9/10 of this supply was made from sisal grown in the Yucatan and exported from Progreso. If the sisal had not been obtained through Progreso, the harvest of the year's crops would have been embarrassed. In response, the United States sent 2 warships to monitor the blockade. and Secretary of State Bryan issued a stiff ultimatum to the New Mexican authorities, declaring that the Navy would use force if the Mexicans did not reopen the port. The threat worked. The situation defused within a month as the Mexicans bowed to pressure and lifted the naval blockade at Progreso. Given the high demand for twine, the dependence on foreign raw materials for its production, and force majeure events such as the Mexican Revolution, one might wonder why rope and agricultural implement manufacturers haven't turned to fiber that could be grown in North America. The U.S. Department of Agriculture at one time studied various fiber crops, paying particular attention to which could be grown in the United States. The reports noted that flax, hemp, and phormium were the only fiber plants suitable for twine that could be successfully grown in the United States. Winters were too cold for the successful cultivation of agave, and fiber from other plants was unsuitable for this purpose. The exceptions were Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Florida Keys, where arid regions could grow, in limited quantities, the traditional raw materials for binder twine, sisal, and henequen. Industrial hemp, sometimes called Kentucky hemp, was the primary fiber for paper and rope production in the 18th and 19th centuries. For many years, it was a major cash crop in Kentucky and was widely grown in Wisconsin and California, to a lesser extent in other states. Twine makers experimented with hemp fiber in the 1880s and 1890s to test its strength and knotting properties for tying, but consistently found that henequen or sisal produced stronger twine. Experiments were also conducted with a species of sedge that grew abundantly in the swamps of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and with flax. But Yucatan sisal remained the preferred fiber. Hemp, sedge, and flax all failed. They couldn't produce a twine tight enough to satisfy farmers or withstand the pressure of a mechanical knotter. They were eaten by crickets and mice, and they disintegrated in bad weather. During the wars, when imported raw materials became less available in the United States and their limited supplies were used for military purposes, some twine producers were forced to switch to alternative raw materials, such as hemp fiber or even paper. In fact, Yucatan sisal remained indispensable for over 4 decades. However, in the 1940s, the introduction of successful combine harvesters eliminated the need for tying sheaves during harvesting. This significantly reduced the need for twine and substantially reduced the demand for Yucatan sisal. Even the advent of hay balers, which also used twine, did not restore the popularity of this tying material. In the 1960s, polypropylene twine appeared in the United States and Canada. However, the first examples of this material were not without their drawbacks. Polypropylene tended to stretch and lose strength under prolonged exposure to ultraviolet radiation. But in 1977, Britain Cordash developed a new, ultra-strong State Route 240 twine, superior in strength to regular wire. This quickly changed the perception of polypropylene twine among both manufacturers and consumers, and finally put an end to the use of twine made from plant fibers.